Kia ora, it's time for Sporting History, and a really special one this week. We're focusing on the career of rugby legend Billy Stead. So Stead or Steed?
Stead.
Stead, thank you. And my guest, Lynn McConnell, calls him one of the most influential players in the early years of All Blacks rugby. He was the first All Blacks Test captain on home soil when they played Britain's touring team in 1904. And we're going to find out a bit more about his life, including his later career as a writer. Lynn McConnell is a historian, sports journalist, and prolific author, and he has just published a book called Billy Stead's Rugby World. He's with me in the Auckland studio. Hi.
Hi, how are you, Jesse?
Good, nice to see you.
Nice to be here.
And you are a proper sports historian. Man, reading through this book, I can't imagine how many hours of research must have gone into it. Papers passed must be a useful thing.
Very useful. It's been a lifelong thing with Billy, as I think I mentioned in the foreword. I had the job of writing the Southland Rugby Union history, a 100-year history, and I was given 5 years to do that, and that gave me a lot of time that you normally wouldn't get in that situation. And to come across his writings from the tour in 1905-06, sort of a column, if you like, was just a godsend. And
that's pretty unusual, isn't it? To be in the All Blacks and writing a column from overseas.
Definitely, and I don't think it's ever been repeated. Certainly, some tours I've come across where guys have written the odd letter back and families get it published in the paper. But this was a regular weekly column throughout the tour, in which I must admit the Sports Hall of Fame under Ron Polinsky, the late Ron Polinsky, published all those in Billy's Trip Home, I think it was called.
Is it interesting reading?
Oh, very much so. It's not because they weren't allowed to talk about the rugby as such. They had, and so it was a social sort of thing as much as anything else.
Tell me about that.
Well, it was observations along the way.
Yeah.
He hated being in Dublin, for instance. He couldn't believe the poverty. He had some interesting experiences in Montevideo because, of course, they went down the Cape to travel. No Panama Canal in those days, so they had to go the long way round. And just the poverty he saw, and it was a mind-opening thing for a lot of these guys because they saw parts of the world that they'd never normally expect to see.
Yeah. And is it fair to say he's not a household name like some others, like perhaps George Napier are?
Yeah, definitely. I think because of the emotional quotient, if you like, with Dave Gallagher being the captain and later dying in World War I, and being a controversial figure on that tour because of his wing forward play, there's been a lot more space given to him. Whereas Billy was sort of the backroom guy that sort of did a lot of the tactical planning because they didn't. There was a controversy during the tour about the fact that they'd sent a coach, in quotes, Jimmy Duncan, but he was sort of basically shoved to one side, and it was the players who did the coaching amongst themselves.
Yeah.
And that was really quite common until the 1950s.
Well, tell us about the game and the sort of turn of the century. Is it similar to what it was? I mean, even the concept of a 5/8 was reasonably new, wasn't it?
Yeah, that had come in about the mid-1890s. The game was vastly different. In fact, Stead, one of the things he complained about was the way that the laws had changed. And I mean, nobody will argue with that. He said he could the laws of the game in his time, he said, could have been written on 3 or 4 pieces of paper.
Yeah.
Whereas now it's a mini book.
Yeah.
and growing.
So good to know they were complaining about the rule changes 150 years ago.
Exactly. And the other factor was we played a different game in New Zealand with the 2-3-2 scrum as against the 3-fronted scrum that all other countries used. So this was an object of some concern during the 1905 tour. Some of the British players had experienced it during that 1904 series, but they didn't think it would succeed on British soil. So they didn't really prepare for it, apart from the Welsh, who did a bit of homework, and they actually played a 2-3-2 scrum in the only game.
So you're talking about the front row, which now everyone knows is
3-fronted.
Yeah,
but they had a 2-fronted scrum, and one of of course, that's only 7 players in the pack. So one of the players became a wing forward, and there was various ways of playing wing forward. You could be an attacker or a defender, or like Gallagher, a player that got amongst the other inside backs and the half-back and first 5 and created mayhem, if you like. Whereas other players like George Gillette, who was on that tour and who Stead rated as the better of the two for his style of play, blended in with the backs and made an extra man in the back line, created diversions and that sort of thing. So it was quite a different game, certainly the way New Zealand played it.
So I'm sure plenty of decent players over that time, apart from your connection to Southland. Why was Billy Stead the one you decided to write a book about?
Well, it was just the fact that a cobbler from Invercargill who'd gone to high school, Southland Boys High, but who really is not the sort of person you would expect to be able to write the amount he did. I mean, it was phenomenal. And it had an instant appeal immediately from finding those papers that he'd sent back. But it was a bit more. As time went by, I realised he'd made much more of a contribution through the years. So after the 05-06 tour, he basically gave rugby away, but then was recalled to captain the team in 1908 against the Anglo-Welsh in 2 tests. He then retired, but then he was talked into coming back in 1910 to go with the first official Maori team to Australia. And he was offered the captaincy. He said, no, somebody else should do it. But he said, I'll happily be vice captain. Yeah. And that was fascinating because being Maori, his great-grandmother was Maori. He hadn't had a lot of contact with his heritage. But that tour, before they started, they had a get-together, a meeting in Rotorua, and that opened up a whole area of his life that he hadn't experienced before. Yeah. And he wrote quite a lot about that experience. And, of course, what happened on tour with the guys. So there was that aspect to it. Then, of course, you have Dave Gallagher dying during the First World War. That's another aspect. Then you've got 1921. He was appointed as coach of the New Zealand team for the first 2 tests against South Africa. He was then dropped after the second test, strangely, and it was decided that the rugby union itself, the New Zealand Rugby Union, would coach the players. Right. So that ended up...
Maybe they should get back into that these days.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. But it was a 0-0 draw, so nobody could say if it was better or worse.
Right.
But, and then, of course, after that, in 1930, he wrote various columns for the Southland Times. In 1930, he covered the first Lions tour, as we know it now, by Britain and Ireland, for Truth, New Zealand Truth, which in those days had a far more respectable, if you like, sports page, and it was one of the better ones in the country. And
so he did all sorts.
Yeah, and this constant writing was the thing, though, and it was in the 1930s, the Southland Times used him as a columnist to talk about local rugby, and he was dropping tips in there about how players could get better. And I think that's borne out in the way Southland rugby in particular went through its greatest era in the end of the 1930s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he was a bit of a thinker then, was he?
Definitely a thinker. He and one of the beauties of doing this book, and you mentioned Papers Past, I came across an item in the Auckland Star in 1909 that was publicising a sports special they were going to run on the following Saturday night. And it listed Stead and several other of the 1905-06 players who were giving their thoughts on the rugby of the day. But I couldn't find the sports special. It wasn't amongst the papers. It had never been processed in the same way. And I had to hunt, and I tried everybody. I tried Fairfax, I tried various libraries. Nobody had a copy of it. And then one day I was looking through the Southland Times for something else, and they'd bought those stories. And so they'd published them in full there. And in his comments, Stead talked about changes that were needed for the game to better it. One of them was they needed to introduce a 5-yard line for lineouts.
Right. Which happened.
Yeah. One was to be easier on what should be called a knock-on, because in those days, even if you bobbled the ball in your hands, that was regarded as a knock-on.
Was it?
Yeah. Nowadays, you could tap it in the air and catch it again, and it's still a knock-on. It's not a knock-on.
Yeah. So they were right.
Yeah. And he also, way back then, said that 25 should, or as they were in those days, 25-yard line, now 22, they should be dropped off from under the goalposts. Now, that happened 120 years later.
Gosh.
And he had
long
the
for
vision,
a rule change.
Yeah, he had the vision to see that.
So these were all suggested by Stead.
Yeah.
Yeah, and all just ways of making the game work a little better.
Exactly. So he was the real technician.
I'm talking to Lynn McConnell, who's a historian, sports journalist, and pretty prolific author. His new book is called Billy Stead's Rugby World. And I presume you don't write a book like this to make millions, Lynn.
No.
Previous
experience tells me that.
Yeah. What does drive you to do it?
I think the stories have got to get out there. I mean, we could go through our lives and never appreciate the contribution that Billy Stead made, or other players as well. And the fact that he wrote, I mean, there's been very few players like him through the years. Perhaps Mark Nichols in the Invincibles in 24-25. He did it for a while, but not as long as Stead. Chris Laidlaw of modern times is probably the only other bloke that's really written in the style that Stead did.
Interesting. Yeah.
It's an unusual thing.
Yeah. And he was a decent player. Tell me about his playing style and the sort of impacts he had on the team. This is the 1904. We're really talking about the All Black team in the early 1900s.
He was always a very good defensive player, tackler, and so forth. He could tidy up play, and perhaps that was his greatest asset. But he also had an eye for the main chance. And I make reference in there to the situation in the Scottish game, the first test of the 05-06 tour. They were down with 3 or 4 minutes to go on a very, very frosty field, and they'd been struggling the whole way. And Dave Gallagher, the captain, actually said, "Billy, we've only got a few more minutes. What can we do?" And they were in their own territory. And he came up with a scheme where they'd fire out a miss-out pass from a scrum, miss out him and the second 5'8", Jimmy Hunter, because that's who the Scots had been concentrating on. Yeah. Got the ball to the centre, and the centre then passed it on to George Smith, famous winger, and he was a former New Zealand Athletics hurdles champion, and he beat the Scottish fullback hands down, cleared out from the opposition, and scored what proved the match-winning try. And years later, on the 24-25 tour, Mark Nichols, who I'd mentioned, had a meeting with George Smith, who'd gone to England to play league. And they went out and had a night with him and Charlie Sealing, who was another member of the 05-06 tour, who'd gone to league. And they had a night out, and Nichols talked to him about the try he scored against Scotland, and asked him if it was one of the greatest tries he ever scored. He said, yes, it was. But he said, I don't claim it. He said, that was Billy Stead's try.
Gosh.
Yeah.
They all seem to give him a lot of credit. I just read from the introduction you were talking about at the 50th anniversary get-together of that tour that was some of them really paid tribute to him.
Definitely. And it wasn't only Jimmy Hunter, there was the other players as well. He had a way about him that allowed him to mix in. But again, when you ask about the style of play that he had, it was interesting in the book that in Southland itself, another player emerged around the same time by the name of Peter Ward, Ginger Ward he was known as.
The great rival.
Yes, the great rival. And he could have actually been better than Stead in an attacking sense. And when they played together, Southland actually beat Auckland in Invercargill, which was a huge occasion, and it's happened very rarely since. But Ward was a peripatetic type of guy. He moved around a lot. He'd played after he first started with Stead in the late 1890s. He went to Australia, and he played in the first Australian Test team to play against the British Isles, and played right through the series. But then got up and went off to war in South Africa.
Oh God,
the African Wars.
I think you described him as the first Test player from Southland.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
But he didn't play for the All Blacks. He played for the Wallabies.
No, it's you got to wonder how effective he might have been if that had been the case.
Gosh.
But that's chance,
Yeah.
and it's just another part of Billy Stead's story.
And sort of diverting here a wee bit, but what were the All Blacks in 1904, 1905 from a national viewpoint? Were they famous?
Very much so.
Yeah.
Rugby was the be-all and end-all.
Can you give us a bit of rugby history in New Zealand?
Well, the game had started in the 1870s. They weren't the All Blacks by that stage, but a New Zealand team had gone to Australia in 1884. Of course, the native team went to Britain in 1888, 89. They played a 2-3-2 scrum as well. And then, of course, the New Zealand Rugby Union was formed, which brought all the unions together under one banner in 1892. And from that point, the black jersey evolved. The team started to tour a bit more in Australia and host Australian teams. And their first tour away was in 1903 to Australia. Okay. And that's where we played our first test. Stead didn't play any tests, but he did make his mark. And, of course, the next year he was chosen as captain of when the British team came here. So by that stage, that was about the only thing that was really united in terms of sport in the country. And it had a huge following. Even though Wellington at that stage was pretty much the central point of the country, people poured in from everywhere to see the test match. on the old athletic park.
Because how would you follow the All Blacks back in those days?
You'd wait for the paper the day after.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, there's no instant communication.
No TV?
No TV, nothing.
No radio?
No.
Maybe a bit of film?
I think the earliest film of the All Blacks is on the 05-06 tour from England. Yeah. So it's a whole different concept, and that's another reason for telling the story, is because they were hardy in those days, and if you were really keen, you might get up and go down to the post office on a Sunday morning after a test match in Britain to find out what the score was.
Gosh.
Yeah.
Incredible. I'm talking to Lynn McConnell about Billy Stead, an All Black in the very early part of the 20th century. An All Black who became a writer. He wrote columns from the 1905 tour to Britain and then released a book down the track called The Complete Rugby Footballer. What was that all about?
That was an absolutely outstanding book that still rates as a quality book, and if you want to know a bit about rugby and how it's played. Some of the stuff is outdated, of course, but they incorporated a history of the game of where rugby came from, and it wasn't from our friend Alice picking up the ball and running with it. There was a game called Haspartum that was played much, much earlier in Roman times, and from those games, and it was the most like rugby more than anything. It was like played between villages with a pig's bladder, and the team that got the other team the ball or the pig's bladder to the other
an actual pig's bladder.
Yeah. So from that, the foundations of rugby came, and it was from that all sports like soccer, rugby, American football.
Well, rugby before soccer.
Yeah, American football, all came from the same derivative.
Aspartum.
Yeah. Haspartum. Yeah. And that's Desmond Morris in a book called The Soccer Tribe has described all this development, and it's a fascinating thing because kings, it used to so consume the medieval towns that kings put out edicts that the game wasn't to be played. It's fascinating, I'll tell you.
Okay, and so his book, The Complete Rugby Footballer, this was a coaching guide?
Well, it was there was coaching aspects of it. It was to tell the story of why the New Zealand system worked so well. So there was tactical stuff, there was historical stuff from things that happened on the tour.
Because we were punching above our weight even in 1905?
Oh, definitely. Because we took what I align it to is the New Zealanders' ability to innovate. And it's not only Team New Zealand winning the America's Cup and various other aspects of sport that you can talk about, but this was the first real example of New Zealand taking on our parents, if you like.
The mother country.
The mother country with a different type of game that they couldn't handle. And they never really got to grips with it.
Ed's listening. He recalls that in the 1950s you would wait at the local dairy until the Sports arrived, a sporting paper with the day's results.
Yes, and what a shame so few of them are actually in the paper's past system, because there's a goldmine of information there.
I was doing a show the other day and someone talked about their dad picking up was it the 8 p.m. on the way back from...
the 8 o'clock?
The 8 o'clock, yeah.
Yeah.
And that was just a paper of sports results.
Yeah, and news and stories, and they were common in most of the cities in New Zealand at the time.
So this player we're looking at today, Billy Stead, if you look at his stats, can you tell he was or do his stats suggest that he was a great All Black? Does it tell the story?
How do you measure greatness? I mean, 44 tries scored by the man he had outside him would suggest that something was right in what he did. But I think the fact that he never played in a losing team, he was good enough to be a captain 3 times in tests. It might not be greatness as we know it now, because there wasn't the media to allow that to happen as such. I mean, you become famous now and a great player.
He wasn't on the Weet-Bix cards.
No, none of those sort of things. So. Yeah, he was a player of his time, a great player of his time.
And then what did he do following his retirement?
From playing?
Yeah.
He got involved with Southland Rugby as a coach and selector. He was one of the panel that chose the Southland team that was the first South Island team to win the Ranfurly Shield when Wellington took the Shield on tour. The local story down south is, of course, that they made the mistake of asking to go out on the oyster boats, and so when they went out, they were taken out on the oyster boats. And
Auckland?
The Wellington,
yeah,
the Wellington team,
right?
And the the locals, of course, when you have oysters, you like to have a beer with them. So they put a few bottles of beer on the boat, and probably more than a few. And the next day after the game, they called in the liaison man who had arranged it all and said to him, "You caused this to happen. You know, we're all heavy in the gut because of the oysters." He said, "Well, you guys asked for it." So yeah, and then of course he was involved with New Zealand rugby and helping with South Island teams, those sort of things, and was always willing to talk rugby with whoever wanted. Brushy Mitchell, who was the New Zealand captain in 1938, a Southlander, who'd moved to Otago, he said that he always talked with Billy Stead, went into his cobbler's shop and always had a chat with him. And he said he never forgot the piece of advice he cherished most was that Billy said to him, wherever you go, always have a ball in your hands.
Really?
Yeah, and just flick it around. He says, me and my mates walked all over Invercargill on Sundays, flicking the ball between us and catching it. And he said,
I love that.
It was just great for our handling.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, the rest of the story is in the book, Billy Stead's Rugby World. Lynn McConnell, the author. Can you tell us a bit about the other work that you've done, Lynn, and how you ended up doing this?
Well, you mentioned, but just before we started, about the Substacks column I have. It's been a very useful weapon for calling it weapon, as a page for sports history, which I don't think we see too much now. And I've tried to develop that along those lines. I've done a series, because nobody else seems to have done anything on the centenary of the Invincibles. So that's just coming to a conclusion in the next couple of weeks.
Oh, great.
I did one on the 1921 Springboks tour, but because that coincided with 100 years for that, but also coincided with the COVID lockdowns. So I was able to put my head down and get stuck into something to keep myself occupied. But there's a lot of other stuff. I was once asked to prepare a book for a publisher that didn't actually see the light of day, but it was a short history of New Zealand sport. So I've got a lot of that material to utilise in the future. And there's some great stories there that people may never have heard or have forgotten about. And that's what I love doing. I love getting into the research, and there's so much that we don't know that we can put in front of people. And I think it all comes together because sport is more than just the game. I mean, the whole thing about the 05-06 team was the sociological side of it. You know, that was a...
Tell me about that.
Well, it was a situation where you had guys going overseas to represent their country for the first time in an official capacity. And they had to look after their families while they were away. There was absolutely no professionalism allowed. The British were very hot on that, and there was controversy after the tour about the 3 bob a day they got for their expenses. Right. And I think...
And this is back in a day when men would have been the breadwinners.
Exactly, in New Zealand.
And they wouldn't have been short tours. You're not jumping on a plane for a couple of weeks.
That's right. And in New Zealand that was the case. But of course in Britain, rugby was played by the upper class. So they were guys that didn't actually have to work.
Gosh.
And they had all the time to prepare.
Yeah.
So this was, a clash of styles, if you like.
Is that why rugby league came about? Because the working class were like, hey, we need some money to survive on.
In the mid 1890s, rugby league started because those guys who played rugby for their managers of their factories that they worked in wanted something to compensate for the time they lost because they did it for nothing. And the rugby union, the British rugby union of the day, would not allow them. And so they just said, right, we'll do it ourselves. And that's where professionalism came from in rugby.
And so were the 2 games identical when they split? And then
they were playing rugby, and then rugby was created from it. A rugby league, was created from it. Yeah.
And then they just sort of diverged as the various rules were changed.
And in the Southern Hemisphere, rugby league really took off during World War I because the Australian Rugby League kept on playing during the war, whereas the rugby players went off to do national service.
How interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so a Substack, by the way, is just a free newsletter or sometimes a subscription newsletter that writers put together to write directly for their audience. And Lynn has one. If you'd like to find it, if you Googled Silver Spoon, sorry, go ahead.
Silver Fern Sports, yeah.
Good stuff. Hey, well done.
Thank you.
Great to have you in.
Yeah, thank you.
Where can people find this book?
Most bookshops should have it, and if they haven't, please ask.